listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me, non-judgmental talk about infidelity with Dr. Marie Murphy. If you're looking for new perspectives on complicated relationship issues, you've come to the right place.
Days go by, they're crawling by.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Marie Murphy, and I'm a non-judgmental infidelity coach. If you are engaging in anything you think counts as infidelity, I can help you deal with your feelings, clarify what you want, and make decisions about what you're going to do. No shame, no blame, no judgments. My job is to help you navigate your infidelity situation in a way that you feel great about, so that you are able to experience love and sex and relationships and intimacy and connection in all the ways that you truly want to, and have enough bandwidth left over for all of the other important stuff in your life too. Infidelity situations can be very exciting and life-affirming and all-consuming, and that can be a pretty cool experience to have, at least for a while. But infidelity situations can also be agonizing in a lot of ways. And while I would be the first person to say that sometimes agony is kind of exquisite, sometimes it really isn't. So when you're ready to start dealing with your infidelity situation in a way that's truly right for you, let me help you do it. There are 2 ways you can have me as your coach. We can work together one-on-one via Zoom, or you can enroll in my online self-guided course, You're Not the Only One. To get started with either option, go to my website, mariemurphyphd.com. I went to see the fantastic W. Kamau Bell a few months ago or several months ago at the Punchline in San Francisco. And although I enjoyed much of what he said very much, one particular thing he said really stuck with me. Whose job is it to resist fascism? He asked the audience. And he supplied his own answer, which was your job, my job, and everybody else's job. Such a simple and to me obvious thing to say, but it struck me all the same. Sometimes we forget that there might not be anybody coming to save us. Sometimes we forget that there might not be anyone else who's going to volunteer to do the hard thing that really needs to be done. Sometimes we forget that if we want to see change in the world, we have to be the change we wish to see in the world. That line is attributed often to Mahatma Gandhi, but others have espoused versions of the same thing. Over and over again, our wisest teachers tell us that it is our job to co-create the world we want to inhabit. And this is relevant to infidelity in potentially a lot of ways, but the specific one I'm concerned with today is this. I quite often work with clients who are engaging in infidelity and are terrified of people they know finding out that they are or have been engaging in infidelity. They're terrified of what people will think about them. They're terrified of what people will say about them. And they're afraid the whole world will shun them. And sometimes people say things to me like, well, if people say bad things about infidelity or bad things about me engaging in infidelity, I don't know what I'll do. Or they just say that if those things were to happen, it would be really, really terrible. They don't want people to say the horrible things they might say. They don't want people to think the horrible things about cheaters that they might think. They just don't want to have to deal with any of that stuff. They don't want those kinds of thoughts and statements to be part of the world we live in. But alas, that stuff is out there. Mainstream understandings of infidelity are what they are. The current dominant conversation about infidelity is what it is. Now, I have talked a fair amount about dealing with other people's opinions in other episodes. And if you're worrying about what other people might say or think about you, go look those episodes up and listen to them if you have not already done so. But today I'm going to offer a different angle on dealing with the things that other people might say and do say about infidelity. Today I'm going to suggest that not only is it your job to learn how to deal with other people's opinions, it just might also be your job to participate in the process of changing the conversation about infidelity, which might be the last thing you feel like doing. But if not you, then who? If you aren't going to speak up and change the conversation around infidelity, who is? Well, I am, and some other people are or have too. But if we want to see big changes in the dominant conversations about infidelity, we need a lot more people to speak up and say their piece if the collective conversation about infidelity is going to change in all of the ways it needs to. And I want you to consider that that includes you. When I suggest this to people, they sometimes get very defensive and they say, well, how am I supposed to contend with the enormity of the ill will towards cheaters all by myself? I can't possibly do it all alone. And people really do get upset, just like that. And it's true, you can't do it all alone. That's right. We need a critical mass of voices, but you can still do your part. Your participation helps build the critical mass. And I encourage you to believe in the value of your own participation. As you may or may not know, I'm a sociologist by training. My PhD is in sociology. And as a sociologist, one of my areas of interest was stigma and how stigma is socially created and socially reproduced, and how stigma is collectively challenged or resisted or transformed. And when it comes to stigma, people who are engaging in infidelity occupy a funny place in the social world. They're engaging in a behavior that is stigmatized, but they don't engage in this behavior collectively. So it's hard for people who are engaging in infidelity to recognize each other as members of a group or even as people who are having similar experiences. Some people who are secretly engaging in behavior that is stigmatized do it with other people who are doing the same thing, or they find ways of congregating with or connecting with other people who are doing the same thing. And so the folks who are engaging in the behavior that's considered stigmatized can recognize that they aren't the only one who does the thing, and they can potentially draw strength and support from being members of a group that has something in common. And when people come together collectively, they can collectively challenge the stigma society has bestowed upon them or their behavior. For instance, in contrast to the experience of people who are engaging in infidelity, in the United States, trans and queer folks had the opportunity to come together in groups, or many opportunities to come together in groups. And they had the Compton's Cafeteria riot in San Francisco, which is a lesser-known precursor to the more famous Stonewall Rebellion in New York. And these collective uprisings are widely seen as the beginning of organized resistance to police harassment of trans, gay, and queer people in the United States. These incidents are recognized as moments in history in which what we now sometimes think of as LGBTQI+ activism began, or anything along those lines. These riots changed history. And they were made possible in part because people who were doing similar stigmatized things or who embodied similarly stigmatized categories of personhood were able to come together and recognize each other and form communities and engage in collective action. And that has had a tremendous impact on history. And to the best of my knowledge, there have not been any comparable moments in history in which people engaging in infidelity have come together and collectively recognized each other and resisted together the stigma foisted upon them. People engaging in infidelity are not usually considered a social group, and they have not engaged in collective action. Again, to the best of my knowledge anyway, I think I'm knowledgeable about such things, but if anyone knows otherwise, please let me know. And I'm talking about in recent times, in relatively recent history. People engaging in infidelity have not come together to create a moment even roughly analogous to queer people standing up, literally and figuratively, to say, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, right? Many scholars argue that the reason why queer rights are what they are today is because of queer social movements. And although I am not suggesting that everything's fine for non-heterosexual folks and for people who reject the gender binary, things have changed a lot in the past however many decades, right? I'm speaking primarily about the United States, but this is true elsewhere in the world too. If you fall anywhere within or near what we sometimes call the LGBTQI+ realm of personhood, life today looks a lot different than it did 50 years ago. Again, in some parts of the world more than others. And that is not because a bunch of straight people woke up one morning and realized, gee, it's not such a big deal to be gay. Queerness isn't threatening to me. People can live out gender in whatever ways they want to. I'm totally fine with those crazy homosexuals doing their thing. That is not what happened. It took a lot of people who were socially marginalized doing brave things over and over again, even when it was scary and hard and sometimes life-threatening for them to do it. And of course, it's not just queer people who have done this for themselves. So many groups of humans have had to stand up and demand their rights and dignity. Maybe you have. Maybe your forebears had to. Maybe you owe your very existence to people who are courageous enough to stand up and say to the world, I have a right to exist, just as I am. Me and my people, we have a right to exist, just as we are. Maybe this is in your blood, right? But then again, maybe you've never had to do that before. Maybe you've never been part of a marginalized or oppressed social group. Maybe you've never contended with stigma. Maybe your ancestors didn't have to struggle to be accepted as fully human humans. Maybe that hasn't been a part of your experience. And furthermore, maybe you've never done anything as an individual that's been considered even mildly unconventional by the standards of your community. Maybe you have lived your life thus far without making too many waves. Maybe you never wanted to make any waves. Moreover, maybe you've never gotten anything but approval your entire life. Maybe you're used to getting a gold star for everything you do, even if that is just existing. And thus, if any of that is the case for you, you may not be the least bit thrilled to find yourself in the position of being a person who is doing a stigmatized thing that some people have very nasty things to say about. You may never have imagined that you would be a person who is doing a thing that other people consider bad. You may never have wanted to find yourself in the position of having to speak up on behalf of yourself or on behalf of anyone engaging in infidelity. You may never have wanted to find yourself in the position of acknowledging behavior on your own part that you consider morally dubious yourself, even if you also see the humanity in your own behavior. So you may be asking yourself, what exactly does she want me to say about infidelity, right? How am I supposed to change the conversation around infidelity? I am not going to answer that question for you in any prescriptive way today. That is something that you get to figure out on a case-by-case basis for yourself. However, I am going to say more about what you could say. And here's the first thing I want you to consider. If somebody says something ridiculous about infidelity in your presence, or if somebody says something ridiculous about you engaging in infidelity to you, you get to choose what you say in response. You don't have to meet other people's blanket judgments of infidelity with blanket defenses of infidelity, right? That's a concern that a lot of people have. They say to me, like, well, if I'm going to defend infidelity, or if I'm going to respond to people's judgments of infidelity, then that means I have to defend infidelity. And I don't know if I feel comfortable doing that. But you don't have to do that, right? Other people may see this as a matter of infidelity simply being bad, end of story. But you do not have to respond as if that assessment has any merit. And you also don't have to respond as if the only option is to make the claim that they're 100% wrong. So, for example, if somebody says something like, oh, all cheaters are damaged people who don't care about other people's feelings, just in passing, just in a conversation that you happen to be participating in, and you want to speak up, you could say something like, well, you could ask a question like, well, how do you know that? Or how can you know that? And by posing that question, you aren't arguing with them. You aren't defending anything. Rather, you're offering a question that implies that there might be room for them to question their position. And maybe they'll do just that. And maybe in that context, that is, in your estimation, the most appropriate way to speak up. And maybe that's just right for that time and place. Also, if you do find yourself in the position of thinking that you do actually have to defend infidelity or defend people who engage in it, but you just can't quite find a way to make defending infidelity seem right to you, there are many other positions you could take if you want to take a position. For instance, you might argue for the need to recognize the complexity of the human experience, perhaps especially when it comes to love and intimate relationships. You might argue for the value of refraining from judging other people's lives. You could make a case for respecting people's privacy and not talking about other people's business when they aren't around. You could argue that there are so many better things to focus on and talk about than other people's so-called failings. There are lots of things you can say and do to contribute to changing the conversation around infidelity. And doing your part to change the conversation around infidelity certainly does not mean that you have to expose all of your private business to the world in general or to any person or group of people in particular. You have the right to share as many or as few details of your own experience as you want to. But, to paraphrase the Rabbi Tarfon, even if it is not your part to finish the task, neither are you free to desist from it. We're all in this together, people. If you want the conversation around infidelity to be different, if you want the dominant discourses around infidelity to be different, if you want infidelity to be less stigmatized, if you want the general public's understandings of infidelity to be more nuanced, you have to contribute to making these changes. Now, I just said you have to contribute to making these changes, but that isn't really true. You don't have to. You don't have to do anything. It is your prerogative to decline to take action, period. If people make general comments about infidelity that you consider abhorrent, you don't have to respond. If somebody says something hideous to you about your experiences with infidelity, you don't have to respond. But if you choose not to respond, I encourage you to think about why you're making that choice. Sometimes there might be good reasons not to speak up. For instance, if you fear for your safety, that's a good reason to not speak up, or at least it sure could be. Or if you are at a moment in your life when you are so depleted that you cannot spare an ounce of energy on anything that isn't essential, well, you might find it reasonable to conserve your energy for what is truly essential. Fair enough. But even if there might be some good reasons to refrain from speaking up sometimes, I also want you to consider that if everyone kept their mouth shut because speaking up was too uncomfortable, we would all be totally fucked. If no one ever spoke up to argue for the humanity of stigmatized behavior or people who are engaging in stigmatized behavior or people who are just stigmatized by virtue of existing, we would be living in a very different world. The way we collectively tend to think about infidelity contributes to a lot of human suffering. And we all have the power and the responsibility to contribute to our collective well-being in the ways that we are uniquely positioned to do so. And even if you never would have chosen this, you may happen to be uniquely well-positioned to speak up about infidelity in ways that change the conversation around infidelity to the benefit of so many of us. I consider this to be a very sad fact of the human experience, but credible sources repeatedly find again and again that people tend to change their minds about things when they personally know someone who has done that thing or is that thing or has been affected by that thing. Like, people start to care about school shootings when they know someone who was killed in one. People start to realize that, hey, maybe transgender people aren't so bad when they realize that someone they know is trans or they see someone going through a gender transition. People begin to get really concerned about climate change when their parents' home goes up in flames or is washed away by a flood or is blown up by a tornado or swept away by a hurricane. Just as a side note, as a former practicing social scientist, I know there's a ton of research on these dynamics, and I know there's a lot more that could be said here. But this isn't primarily a social science podcast, so I'm not getting into the weeds. I'm just putting a general point out there that I really want you to think about. And that point is, you speaking up about infidelity in any way you can matters. If you speak up and challenge the conventional thinking about infidelity, people who know you and take you seriously may be prompted to question their own thinking about infidelity in a way they otherwise might not have. Ever, ever, ever. And yes, that might include saying something about your own experiences, but it doesn't have to. However, if you do choose to speak up about your own experiences, two interesting and important things may happen. You may find that other people become willing to share about their experiences too. Sometimes we find that when we're brave enough to be the first person in a room to speak up about something, everybody else speaks up too. Everybody recognizes that they've been keeping the same secret and that it's actually okay to talk about it. And when this happens, the ripple effects can be profound. I mean, not to mention the immediate effects, but the change that can come from being willing to be the first person to share, and then everybody else recognizing that they're not alone in the thing that they think they're alone in, that's a big deal. The other interesting and important thing that may happen if you choose to speak up about your experiences with infidelity is that you may educate the fuck out of some people. Let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, back when this coaching practice of mine was just a twinkle in my eye, I worked for a large public organization that had many units or divisions within it, or maybe units and divisions, or whatever they were called at this particular organization. I don't remember, and it doesn't matter. What does matter is that at some point during my employment with this organization, somebody came to the conclusion that domestic violence just might be something that people who worked for the organization might be experiencing. And of course, the focus was on people who might be on the receiving end of domestic violence, and there was no talk of the possibility that some employees might be enacting the domestic violence and might want help changing their behavior, which is interesting, right? Well, anyway, the organization came up with the idea to train domestic violence liaisons in each of the units or the divisions or whatever they were. And these domestic liaisons were supposed to be people who were trained to do something or another and then flagged as people who employees experiencing domestic violence, that is, people on the receiving end of domestic violence, could come to and ask for help. That was the idea. And I volunteered to be one such domestic violence liaison, in part because I didn't have a whole lot to do with this particular job, but I was required to sit at my desk or otherwise be accounted for 8 hours a day, and there's not a lot I wouldn't have done to pass the time. But I also did it in part because I thought the whole thing could be interesting and potentially even important. And it did turn out to be interesting, albeit in many ways that were more depressing than anything else. The Domestic Violence Liaison Program was kicked off by a big training. And the other volunteers were mostly white ladies who wore conservative outfits and conservative haircuts and looked like they had probably never had anything to do with domestic violence in their lives. Now, let me pause and make a couple things clear. I am a white lady myself, but there are different breeds of white people, and this was a group that I did not feel I had much in common with aside from my skin color, right? Also, I want to make it clear that in making the assessment that these ladies had probably never had anything to do with domestic violence, I was making some big assumptions. I'm totally aware of that. But that was my reading of the room, however correct or incorrect it may have been. Similarly, the training was led by a few frumpy-looking white ladies who looked like they probably never had anything to do with domestic violence in their lives. Yes, I know that people's appearances can hide multitudes. I know that well. But when I judged these books by their covers, this was the story I saw. There were exactly 2 men in the room. One was a 50-something white guy who I worked with and I knew to be a rather straight-laced fellow, which depressed me mightily given his role within the organization. The other man was a Latino guy with neck tattoos and face tattoos. He was, as far as I could tell, the only person of color in the room. So this was the group I saw when I walked into the training room. And I started thinking to myself, how is this going to go? What exactly is going to be taught and learned about here today? By the way, this organization was far more, it was a big public organization. It was a pretty diverse workforce, and it served a very diverse group of people. So this little cadre of domestic violence liaison trainees was not representative of either the workforce or the population being served, right? So there was that. And then I'm sitting there thinking, my own understanding of domestic violence is in no way extensive, but nor was it completely non-existent. I had some familiarity with the sociological research on facets of domestic violence, and I had been of some help to folks who were on the receiving end of domestic violence in the past. Once the training actually got started, I quickly became worried that the trainers had even less knowledge of or experience with domestic violence than I did. Among other activities, they had us learners form small groups and read short vignettes about people, all women, who were experiencing domestic violence, always at the hands of men in these stories, and choose from 3 options the way that we, as domestic violence liaisons, should respond to the victim. And the not so funny thing was, all of the options were pretty much the same. All of the options basically boiled down to, you should tell the woman to hurry up and leave the man who is beating her. Now, that wasn't quite the language that they offered to us. I'm exaggerating a little for effect, but that was pretty much the essence of it. And I quickly grew despondent. Over and over again, after rotating through different small groups and discussing different vignettes and how we would respond to them, the ladies kept saying things like, well, she can't go back to him, or it's our job to save her. There was no mention from the facilitators of the training of why people who are on the receiving end of domestic violence sometimes have a hard time extricating themselves from their relationships with their abusers. There was no discussion of the possibility that domestic violence might be perpetrated by people other than men. Important side note, I'm being sarcastic here. Domestic violence is perpetrated by people other than men. I just could not believe that these trainers made no mention of that. That's the end of the side note. There was not any mention of the fact that people other than women could be on the receiving end of domestic violence. There was no discussion of non-heterosexual relationships. Nobody, facilitators or participants, shared their own experiences with domestic violence. Nobody said anything that I considered to be even remotely well-informed about domestic violence. It was as if a bunch of well-meaning but completely ignorant people basically pulled this training out of their asses, which is quite possibly exactly what happened. As the training wore on, I can't remember if it was a full day or a half day, I started feeling like I might explode. Although I was pretty sure I didn't know what constituted a good enough domestic violence liaison training, I was very sure that this thing I was participating in was not a good enough domestic violence liaison training. And I was growing increasingly distressed about what I considered to be the day's more glaring omissions and misrepresentations. Did I mention that I was feeling like I might explode? Time started dwindling down, and the nice, well-meaning ladies kept talking about how we had to save the victims of domestic violence from the bad men who do the bad things to them, and how bad it is for people to physically hurt their partners. And although all day the fear I had about the lack of power I might have as a lone voice of a contrary perspective had kept me from saying some things I considered important to say, I finally spoke up. And I said, I think we need to expand our perspectives a little bit here. I think we need to get away from the idea that perpetrators of domestic violence are these horribly bad people. I think we need to remember that people are assholes because they suffer, and I think we need to remember that engaging in asshole behavior does not make people any less human than we are. I think we need to remember that people who hit their partners are our brothers and sisters, and we are just like them in more ways than not. Let me tell you, people, my voice was shaking when I said all of this. This was many years ago, and I remember this moment well. My whole body was probably shaking too, and I probably had copious amounts of sweat pouring out of my armpits, visible to anyone who might have cared to notice. The organization that I was working for at the time was something of a police state in some respects. Dissenting opinions weren't exactly welcomed, and they certainly weren't invited. So I was more than a little scared to speak up. And as soon as I started talking, everybody's heads whipped around, and I had a room full of eyes staring at me. And when I finished speaking, you could have heard a pin drop, but only for a moment. After I said my little piece, Latino neck tattoo guy looked at me and said, "Thank you for saying that. I used to be a domestic abuser, and I have changed, and that's why I'm here now, so I can help be a part of the solution instead of being part of the problem." And let me tell you, all of the conservative-looking white people in the room practically jumped out of their chairs. They had spent all day in the presence of the enemy. They could have been wounded themselves. This former domestic abuser in their midst could have hit one of them, or all of them. Oh my God! Obviously, I don't know what any of them were actually thinking. I'm taking a little bit of speculative license here. But I did see their facial expressions. I did see the changes in their body language, and the changes were pretty pronounced. And then, as luck would have it, time was up, and that was how the so-called workshop ended. And I walked out of that so-called workshop thinking two things. What if Neck Tattoo Guy's comments had started the event rather than ended it? Where could the whole thing have gone if that had been the beginning? It seemed to me that his comments, and more of them, would have been a useful starting point. Why wasn't he running the training, was another thought I had. The other thing that I thought about was that the room full of domestic violence liaisons in training probably learned more from neck tattoo guy's brief comments than they had from the rest of the workshop. Can I know for sure whether this actually happened? Of course not, but it's my best guess. My best guess is that his brief statements were more educational than the rest of that whole training combined. And then, of course, given the topic of this podcast episode, it's worth asking, would neck tattoo guy have spoken up if I hadn't spoken up and said what I said? There's no way of knowing, but he sure didn't say anything before I said something. So this is an example of how important it is to do your part. It may not be your part to say the whole thing. It may not even be your part to say a lot, but it might be your job to say something. You never know how your contribution to the conversation around infidelity will make a difference. To paraphrase Gandhi again, you have to do what you deem to be the right thing or the important thing. And it may not be that you get to see all of the consequences of your efforts or all of the benefits of your efforts. You may not get the instant gratification of seeing the impact of your actions. You may not even get the long-term gratification of seeing the eventual impact of your actions. But you have to do the right thing. You have to do the important thing. Because if you don't, there will be no result. Or put differently, if you don't do the right thing might not be done. It might not ever be done. If you think that dealing with the way that infidelity is stigmatized now sucks, think about how much worse it might have been for your ancestors. Think about how much more nuanced and humane you want the collective conversation about infidelity to be. For yourself, for your own benefit, and for the benefit of future generations. If you want change in this realm, I invite you to recognize your power to contribute to making the changes you wish to see become reality. All right, people, that's it for today. If you want my help navigating your infidelity situation in a way that's truly right for you, let's get to work. Enroll in my self-guided course, You're Not the Only One, or schedule yourself an introductory coaching session to get started working with me one-on-one via Zoom. You can do both of those things through my website, mariemurphyphd.com. Thank you all so much for listening. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me with Dr. Marie Murphy. Make sure to click subscribe to get updates on our latest episodes.